Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. And thank you guests from Thailand and overseas for joining us in another activity of PSU Open Mobility 2021. And I wish this would be a productive moment for us all to exchange ideas. Today, our invited speaker will cover the topic of writer identity for academic publishing. However, this activity will not be made possible without the kind contribution of our moderator. I would like to thank Associate Professor Dr. Prakasit Sititikun for running the show today. As a brief introduction, Associate Professor Dr. Prakasit is a full-time lecturer of the Language Institute, Thammasat University, Thailand. He earned a doctorate in language and literacy studies with a concentration in second language reading processes at the University of Illinois, USA. He is currently a vice president for conferences and professional network, Asia TEFL. He is also an associate editor of 3L journal, Language, Linguistics, Literature, which is in Scope Quartile 1. He was the past president of Thailand Teacher Organization. He has extensive experience in teaching training throughout Thailand. His areas of interest include second language literacy, cognitive and sociocultural factors in second language learning, and intercultural issues in second language learning. Now, to cut to the chase, I'm going to let Associate Professor Dr. Prakasit continue with the session.
Thank you very much, Assistant Professor Dr. Yusuf Bunsu, for the nice introduction about me. Hello, Sawadee krab, everyone. Greetings from Bangkok, Thailand. Welcome to the virtual seminar hosted by the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Prince of Songkhla University. As introduced by Dr. Yusuf, I'm Prakasit Sititikun from Thammasat University. I would like to thank PSU for hosting this valuable academic activity, which allows us to have a golden opportunity to virtually meet and to learn from distinguished scholars and participants from different countries around the world. And I am filled with great pleasure to perform a very important duty to moderate the seminar today. Actually, I feel really excited because we are so lucky to have a very well-known guest speaker to give us a talk. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, let me inform you of today's topic. It is Evolving Writer Identities for Academic Publishing in Applied Linguistics. Our guest speaker is very experienced, and I'm sure that we will learn many useful ideas from this very timely topic from the guest speaker. And before we get started, I would like to inform you about the format of the seminar. After the introduction, our guest speaker will give a talk for about 1 hour and 45 minutes, more or less. If you have any questions, please wait until the end of the talk for the Q&A session. So during his talk, if you have any questions, you can send them to the chat box. I will select some of them for the speaker to answer at the end, or you can speak out your question. Ladies and gentlemen, now please let me introduce our guest speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Jim Mckelly. Dr. Jim Mckelly is Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics and TESOL at UCL Institute of Education, University of London. Having started his academic career at the University of Sydney, Australia, he then taught for many years in Japan's oldest EMI program, Sophia University in Tokyo, before relocating to the UK in 2016. His research explores implications of globalization for second language writing, language education, and teaching in higher education. He has co-authored and co-edited several books on research methods in applied linguistics, and he currently serves as an editor-in-chief for the journal system. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Mckelly. Dr. Mckelly, now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining. I hope today's session is useful for you. One of the things I should say about the amount of time that I'll spend talking in the actual presentation and the amount of time that I'd like to spend with you in the Q&A, is I know, especially on this topic, that we'll likely have some really important questions from you. So I'm going to try to keep the amount of talking that I do down a bit to make sure that we leave ourselves enough time for a hopefully productive Q&A session. I am going to, in this talk, focus a lot of what I'm doing based on a project that was funded by the Center for Doctoral Education here at UCL. This project was designed to help develop things like supervisory skills for doctoral students. So thinking about them as early career researchers and thinking about their academic careers ahead of them, right? In this process, because of my interest in second language writing, a lot of the focus was on the development of writing in English and thinking about writing in English at a level that is publishable. Now, the way that this works in terms of its, the way that it works in terms of practices, what I'm going to ask everybody to think about is really how this is relevant to you. Right? So as you're listening, just think about, how can I make connections with this? Where do I fit in? Because this whole idea of developing academic publishing skills in relation to your own evolving writer identities means that everybody's going to be at very different stages. So even if I do refer to doctoral students or early career researchers or wherever it is, even if you don't identify with any of those identifiers that I use in the presentation, just think about this as, right, okay, this is where I see my writer identity. This is kind of how far I've gone. And when I'm getting into some of the kind of detailed ideas about how you can work with your own writer identity and recognize different identities in the writing that you do, just try to do a bit of reflection on your own writing. And I think especially if you have any writing that you're doing right now that you think is particularly difficult or that you're struggling with, have a look at it and think about asking the questions of that writing in a way that we addressed some of those issues in the project that we're working on here. So I think that's kind of most of the background on this, and just kind of framing this and setting this up for you to think about, what can you get out of this, and where do you see yourself fitting into it. And hopefully by the end of this, and as you practice a little bit, maybe with some of the ideas here, you can recognize, right, some of these different identities, the way that they come up in this framework, and think, right, maybe this isn't the person I want to be in this statement, right? This isn't coming out the way that I want it to be stated for the purposes of what it is I'm trying to say. So yeah, any questions that you have in relation to anything like that, please do put them in the chat. We'll talk about them at the end. And just as we go, because I think as I go through this, there'll probably be questions coming up. So yeah, don't necessarily save all your questions for the end. Go ahead and keep it active. Okay, so yeah, this idea of evolving writer identities for academic publishing and applied linguistics is see if I can get that. Comes from this idea that when writing and when kind of getting inducted into an academic community and being a part of that academic community, so depending on where you are, we're always kind of needing to deal with this question of who am I? And in particular, this question of who am I as an early career researcher is one that we see in the literature. So I'm referring here to a really interesting chapter by Morton and Storch, who write about this idea of authorial self in doctoral level or advanced level writing for publication purposes. I'm going to talk about where authorial self fits into the framework that I use for our bigger study here through the Center for Doctoral Education. But essentially, the idea behind this is, who am I as the researcher and writer, and with what authority do I speak? So this is a question that you kind of want to be able to answer, as you're preparing something for publishing, and something that you may even just, I don't know, particularly when you're writing something collaboratively, to think about, well, what are all of our roles in this piece of writing, and how am I getting my ideas through? How am I getting my ideas through confidently, with the kind of support and engagement in a broader academic community that allows me to say what I want to say. Now, I'm just going to kind of briefly address two of the bigger areas, bigger obstacles to being able to write with authority, and they are imposter syndrome and the ivory tower. Now, these are two concepts that may or may not be familiar to everyone in the group. So if you do have more questions about this, please do go ahead and put them in the chat. But basically, with imposter syndrome, right, this is this whole idea that you feel that you're not good enough, right? And that you feel that your contribution to what you're writing isn't going to be received well, right? That readers are not going to get it. That readers are going to think, oh gosh, you don't know what you're talking about. Why are you writing this, right? That whole idea is really one where you feel isolated from the academic community in which you're trying to communicate your ideas. So that's the first thing, right, is to think about how do I ensure that I am connecting, that I'm engaging with the academic community, with the readers of what it is that I'm trying to write. This idea of isolation and inadequacy are common. And the whole issue really are these competing demands. So this quote from Wilson and Kutry that I really like, where they say, the knowledge and skills that must be acquired during a higher degree by research are specific to the candidate. So this is an important thing to consider, both for those of you who are joining who are doctoral students and also those of you who are here as supervisors, thinking about how can I communicate my specific needs to, right, getting through this process. And as a supervisor, right, how can I make sure that I'm understanding what my students' specific needs are? How can I address them to ensure that imposter syndrome isn't weighing them down, to ensure that they don't feel isolated or inadequate? Being able to address specific needs of the candidate is kind of an interesting concept because it sounds like common sense, right? That we would say as supervisors, we recognize, right, that we're working one-to-one much of the time, right, as a supervisor with a doctoral student. A lot of the problem comes down to the sort of institutional structures, recognizing that every doctoral student ultimately has that same goal of producing that thesis and increasingly, and it's a part that I'm going to get into, also publish and be published by the time they complete their PhD. Now, I don't know, and I'll get some clarity from you on this about what the specific rules are in higher education in Thailand around publishing. But for example, in the UK, a PhD student can finish and get a doctorate without publishing. The problem from there is trying to get a job. So, right, especially getting a job in really kind of any academic position that has a research element. Maybe some of the teaching roles are possible, but without a kind of clear teaching experience or without the clear research experience, I think this is where, with an increasingly competitive job market, right, we need to make sure that we've kind of been able to show that. So really, even though it's not an institutional requirement in UK higher education for doctoral students to have published, really no UK institution is going to hire a new lecturer without, right, that evidence of research beyond the thesis. So these are the things to kind of keep in mind about needs. And those kind of, the needs that are specific to the candidate really does come down to what are the kind of defining features of who this person is as a researcher? How does that come through? And certainly, thinking about the number of PhD and EdD theses that I've examined or that I've chaired those examinations, I know that the really strong sticking point for so many people is what is the ownership of ideas? What is the identity of this researcher? How does this researcher identify themselves in what they're writing? What is it that they kind of are the expert of, right? So that's so that big question in a doctoral examination. What is the contribution of your writing? They're looking for a really strong connection between the contribution and the person. So this is something that we don't always necessarily make explicit, but I want to, along with Wilson and Kutry, try to express this point because I do believe that it helps for a stronger connection and avoiding feelings of imposter syndrome. The idea of ivory tower is an interesting one. It's a kind of older idea, but basically the one is that academia is a space for old white men who occupy an ivory tower where only very experienced others can join them. So Gray and Chappell have this really excellent paper where they kind of pose that question as, is that really the case about academia? And it's connected to imposter syndrome because there's this idea that, somehow I'm inadequate, somehow I'm not there where those people are, right? Those super experienced people. And creating this concept of an ivory tower is an interesting one because it then also introduces race. And then it also potentially, right, and where Gray and Chappell raise it, gender as well. So the idea that academia, especially English language academia, is a space for older white men is a scary one, right? Because then you sort of feel like, well, wow, right? Unless I'm an older white man, I am not a part of what's happening, and I am immediately and forever and always distanced and not a part of that community. So the reality, of course, is that all of this is made up, right? I mean, there is no actual ivory tower. But at the same time, it is important to recognize, right, that there are certain, the realities around this, right? Recognizing people's distance from what is expected of who is engaging in that community, right? So kind of picturing yourself as part of that community is a really important part of this. I think, not going too far into ideas around race and gender, but this idea of just feeling separated and not feeling a part of it. The thing to remember is that it's all in the head, right? So it really is something that, right, as long as you have that ownership of your idea and who you are, of course, in academia, and I think especially in applied linguistics, there is great interest, right, in that diversity of ideas and bringing in a broad range of ideas and identities into making these connections with arguments and publishable statements and publishable studies. So this is more where I'm kind of encouraging people to, regardless of the kind of research it is, making it clear, right, kind of who you are as a researcher and recognizing that it's not about trying to be something you're not. And I think that's where especially, doctoral students will feel like that, saying, oh, I need to write like a professional person. I need to write like a published person, right? And it's like, no. You need to be that publishable person, right? And you need to show us that. And that uniqueness that you're bringing to this is what makes it so exciting and what makes it so publishable. I see this all the time as an editor at System in cover letters, right? That people will kind of say, oh, I'm a part of this camp or this school of thought around issues of positive psychology and emotion and language learning, or I'm a part of this. And I keep thinking, that it's good to kind of let us know, kind of who are the key scholars and key arguments that you're engaging with, but tell us, who you are. I want to know, what's prominent about this, what's unique about this. And particularly, I think, for people publishing in English from Thailand, there's so much potential there, right? There's so much to be said about what it means to be doing work and research in that context, to grow up in that context and have all of that inform who you are and your ideas and your arguments. Let that come through. I think is the thing I really want to emphasize there. Okay, so in this, in the idea of the pressure to publish, right? So like I was saying, in the UK, there isn't necessarily the immediate pressure. You can get a PhD without having published. But we recognize that pretty much every doctoral student these days, right, there is pressure, whether it's coming from the institution or it's coming from themselves or their supervisors, wherever it's coming from, there is pressure to publish as a doctoral student. This has been around for quite some time. Here I'm highlighting a paper from Jun Lei on neoliberal ideologies in Chinese university requirements, and looking particularly at their reward schemes for doctoral publications. A really interesting paper. In this paper, he raises the ideas about publish or perish, publish or no degree, right? These concepts that have been around. And he highlights some of the kind of key scholars from the past. So in relation to things like graduation requirements for publishing, this not a new idea, right? Depending on where in the world we're talking about. But the work of Chris Castanet, for example, from 12 years ago, and Pejman Habibi, as well as Lee just 6 years ago. For PhD by publication, which is an interesting construction. I don't know how much of that's really happening in Thai universities, but we are seeing it increasingly in UK universities in applied linguistics. It's something that's been around in other disciplines, but we are starting to see them more in applied linguistics. But these ideas are again, not new, right? So people like Kamler have written about it, and I'll highlight that in a moment. Robbins and Kanowski, and then as well as Sharman et al. So these are all different examples that in Jun Lei's paper is highlighted. So I just wanted to kind of highlight them to you so that if you look at that paper, you can see where these ideas are coming from. And then the other really great, this is a quote from Radin that was used by Lei, where he says, well, yeah, the pressure for researchers to demonstrate their research performance seems to have become normalized and part of the habitual working practice of academia. And that's from 11 years ago. So it's really interesting to think, right, okay, so the pressure that I'm thinking is just kind of coming into it, it's been around. So, where I recognize I fit into this, I should recognize that there is a history to this. It kind of makes sense, when you think about the different ways of kind of showing or evidencing your ability to work with research and to be able to write, in that particular, in those genres of research writing. Writing a thesis is just one of them, right? So being able to also show your range and ability by having published papers, I get it, right? So, but we want to think about what that means in terms of defining who you are and defining what your arguments are and creating a research profile and trajectory, right? That kind of allows you to develop and become more publishable. So yeah, what we can think about, and this is kind of getting into the project that we conducted through the Center for Doctoral Education at UCL, are ideas about support and training for doctoral publishing, specific for doctoral publishing. And the reason that this is particularly, I think, relevant for everybody here is to think about kind of where you fit into this, right? So what kind of support do you provide as a supervisor? What kind of support does your institution provide? What kind of support can you potentially engage your students in? As doctoral students, the doctoral students who are here today do have a look, right, to see, well, what is on offer, right? What type of support is available in my institution? What kinds of things could I talk with my supervisor about in terms of developing the kinds of skills involved in doctoral publishing? And how is that different from writing for my PhD or writing my thesis? So yeah, instruction in research publishing. So this is something that, that we've seen kind of coming up in institutions all over the place. A lot of the examples in relation to these are often in the United States, but we are kind of right from a long time ago, but we're seeing it increasingly right in around the world. But sort of specific workshops. So the example that's in the image here is at UCL from last summer on doctoral education and its purposes, research training for a changing world. So this had a whole kind of collection of different workshops, and one of them was mine on this idea of developing a writer identity. So having these events are really potentially very productive for not just students, but for supervisors as well. So this was something that was attended by a whole range of people. Publishing and doctoral writing pedagogy, so writing from and beyond the thesis. So this is getting into these ideas from Kamler. I really like this quote. This kind of pedagogical work is generally sporadic and mostly ad hoc, rather than sustained or part of a broader reconceptualization of doctoral education. So here's something from 2008, where there are calls for reconceptualizing doctoral education. I think these calls are still ongoing. I think there's still a lot of questions and around what doctoral education is supposed to be, and how much we should be engaging in kind of shaping things. Obviously, doctoral work a lot of it is autonomous, right? There's a really important requirement of the ability to work independently, and that needs to be shown, right, in a thesis to kind of pass the examination, right, to be able to show, yes, these are my ideas, I did this, right? This wasn't just all fed to me by my supervisors. So we know that part of things, but in terms of how we actually shape that and develop that, there hasn't necessarily always been a lot of clarity. And I think institutions do things, and there's been some sharing of that between institutions. A lot of really great journals out there on higher education and higher education practices, teaching in higher education, continuing education. A lot of these journals do focus on these elements, but we don't necessarily specifically see them related to people using English not as their first language. And so this is where, applied linguists, right? Really, this is a call to all of you out there for applied linguists to really, take advantage of this and recognize that we have this huge, right, area of higher education studies with journals with impact factors that, go beyond applied linguistics, impact factors journal, impact factors. But this is, there's some real opportunities here. It's some real connections that can be made for applied linguistics and for applied linguists with higher education studies. So yeah, have a look at some of that work and think about what is it that applied linguists can do to kind of help doctoral studies development, particularly thinking about how this is relevant for all doctoral students, right? It's not just those doing doctoral work in applied linguistics. This idea of doctoral publishing as professional development is one I'll get into in a moment. This interesting paper from Wilkins, Hazam, and Lean from last year. But just this idea of a university or institutions introducing rules for doctoral publishing, and Jun Lei actually talks about this in his paper as well in the Chinese higher education context, that the idea is that it's part of a professional development program, right? And that is the way that the Center for Doctoral Education, which was a center that was created for these purposes at UCL, is designed, right? So it's a professional development center for doctoral students and doctoral supervisors. So that was the UCL Center for Higher Education Studies hosted event. So at UCL, we have an entire center dedicated to higher education studies. I am actually a member of the Center for Higher Education Studies at UCL, as well as the Center for Applied Linguistics. And I'm one of 3 people who straddle the two centers. So we can see, right, this is an area of growth. So thinking about, so I mentioned it already quite a few times, but thinking about jobs, right? Thinking about what is the process of doing a PhD and how does that relate to, right, what happens after the PhD. This is highlighting the work of Horta, who's in Hong Kong, who does a lot of this work on kind of sustainable skills, particularly in relation to employability. And in the workshop that he presented at that event in June of last year at UCL, he talked about some work that he's been doing where he's been investigating some of the views of students in East Asia. So he had doctoral students in Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea who he spoke with and highlighted a few of these kind of key concern areas. So research-oriented skills, right, was something that they recognized as part of the doctoral process that hopefully then they can use for their own employability, right? So thinking about what is the transfer of skills between doing a doctorate and employability. So they talked about innovation, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, flexibility, and methodology. And that's thinking about research-oriented skills across, right, a kind of spectrum like that, looking at all those different areas is really an interesting thing. Often we stop at things like critical thinking, right? We kind of say, you need to kind of show us that you are writing at doctoral level. You need to show us that you're thinking at doctoral level. And we don't necessarily get into what that means and beyond sort of this idea of critical thought. So I really appreciated, right, that this came from the voices of the students, right, that they were saying, oh, these are the areas that we see kind of making the most sense: innovation, creativity, and critical thinking and problem solving, I think, go together, but then also flexibility with methodology. And that gets into some of the other work that I do in relation to kind of honesty in writing and reporting, and reporting on research. And recognizing that a lot of the research that we do, the social research, is very messy. I think, for a lot of early career researchers, and certainly for doctoral students, kind of and recognizing doctoral students as early career researchers, it's so daunting to think about what's expected of them and what they need to be able to show, because so much of the research that they read and so much of the research methodology literature that they read presents research as this kind of idealized, sanitized, process where research projects and methodologies goes right. They go smoothly. Everything goes to plan, right? So when you read a research paper, you kind of look at this and they say, here was my methodology. Methodology went perfect. Here were my results. And there's really kind of no section in any of these papers about well, here's where things really went wrong with my methodology, and this is where I had to make adjustments to it. I think increasingly for doctoral writing, I think supervisors, we're seeing this more, and certainly as an examiner, I'm seeing it more, where they're recognizing the strengths of early career researchers, I think in particular, going through the process, the thought processes in their thesis, right? Kind of saying, well, this is what I tried, and this is what didn't work about it. This is why I think it didn't work. This is what I did as a solution, right, to get beyond that. So it is interesting because along with my frequent collaborator, Heath Rose, we put together an edited volume of kind of experiences of different scholars, of kind of big obstacles that they dealt with and how they got over them to kind of smooth things out, as a way of just kind of showing early career researchers, look, this is the norm. This is, problems with research happen all the time. And yet, right, we don't really have that kind of clear to them, right? It's not part of our instruction. It's not part of our academic community that we say, oh, we messed up. Something else in relation to this that's interesting, and it's something that I worked on for a while, but I haven't even had the courage to share it yet. But there's this idea of a CV of failures. So the idea is that on your CV of failures, you list every time you've had a paper rejected by a journal. You list every time you've had a research funding application rejected. You have a list of every conference abstract that you've submitted and was rejected, right? So it's this kind of list of rejections. And there's so much value in something like this. For one, kind of showing other people that, look, right, we all go through this. But I think as well, being able to kind of take that somewhere to kind of say, so it's not just the list, right? It's being able to kind of say something about it. So what was it about what we did here? So I'm thinking about this, I think, because I've got my kind of list of failures, but I haven't been able to kind of expand that to show, what is the contribution this is making to who I am as a researcher. But being able to kind of say, look, these are the areas, this is what I did. So yes, this didn't work for these reasons. This is what reviewers said or examiners said. This was the feedback that I had, and this is where I took it, right? So to kind of then make a connection to where some things were successful and some things weren't, right? There were certain research projects that I did, where the papers out of it just never got published, right? There was something kind of fundamentally problematic about what we were doing with that research project, something in relation to the research question, the structure of the study. It was never going to be publishable as hard as we tried. So, there are things like that you kind of feed into it. You kind of say to yourself, well, what did I learn from that? How did I get that? So certainly for doctoral students, thinking about being able to show that in a thesis and to be able to engage with that, to think about, so it's not just here are the limitations and here's why I think it's okay, or here are the limitations and this is why I couldn't deal with it. It's more about, this was what went wrong. This is how I fixed it, right? This is how I got beyond that problem. And this is what I learned from it. And this is how it helped to shape who I am as a researcher and my understanding about doing research on this topic or doing research in this way. So these are the things I think I want to try to highlight about that in what I do. But I think it's, it's great that Horta's got this sort of from students in his study saying these things like, we need to show that we're able to do this stuff. But it's not clear exactly what kind of frameworks allow us to do that or what structures allow us to say what went wrong. Managerial oriented skills, I think, is an interesting one. It's one that I regularly highlight with students when they ask me, my doctoral students, when they ask me questions about, what am I doing in relation to transferability of skills? And one of the big things I say is project management. It's you're learning how to manage a project, a really big one, right? One that takes years and has all these different stages and elements and considerations and working drafts and thinking about how you move beyond them. So it was good to see students recognize that, as well as project management as an important one. Teamwork, I think, is one that we don't always necessarily think about. Doctoral research and a lot of the research I think that we do, we kind of think, oh, it's my research, it's something I do. There are a lot of incentives still, in different university structures for people to solo publish, right? So, when they talk about promotion, for example, they say, oh, how many of these papers have you solo published? And, I think we need to kind of stop and think about that. So if you've got a whole list, long list of only solo authored papers, where is the teamwork? Where is the collaboration? Where is the, you know, so we want to kind of think about at least a balance with those things as much as possible. And the students are recognizing that too. They also talked about networks, responsibility, and pedagogy, right? So we can see, you know, some of these ideas, teamwork, networks, kind of going together. Responsibility, a lot of what they talk about and what Borta shared was really this sense of becoming a researcher, right? So kind of taking responsibility and ownership of a lot of these, of the doing of the research project, right? So the actual stages, timing things, timelines, sticking to deadlines, right? Recognizing they have to do that themselves. And then with pedagogy, it's also really interesting because you think about that in relation to, as a managerial oriented skill, that there's a point about this, the structure of pedagogy, right? Thinking about how do I take what I'm learning through this process and then carry it through to what I then do, right? So it's, I mean, we ask master's students to do this often, right? We'll say kind of, oh, reflect on your learning experiences and share these then in your responses to these task prompts, you know, for these papers at the master's level. At the doctoral level, you know, somehow it's expected that they just already do it, right? So it doesn't necessarily work that way. There are ways of fostering this, and really talking about something like pedagogy as a managerial skill is a really interesting one. So what is it about things like supervisory practices? How does this then make its way into the student and carry on into transferable skills? I think for the most part, most of us supervising would admit that, you know, really what we know about supervising, we learned from our supervisors, right? In some cases, maybe we learned what not to do, right? For those of us who maybe didn't have great experiences with our supervisors. But, you know, for the most part, a lot of it is really kind of taking what we thought worked the best and then putting those into practice ourselves. But finding something more structural, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and the students recognize that. With the, on the main study findings, the idea of flexibility that was really interesting was that the students, they raised it in terms of research-oriented skills, but they didn't perceive it necessarily as valuable. And I think that's a really, really interesting point, because I think a lot of it is this idea that to kind of display a flexibility or kind of wanting a flexibility in very fixed structures, just, right, they're experiencing resistance. I know a lot of supervisors will tell their students as well, kind of, you know, they'll say, oh, I really want us to kind of be flexible or take a more flexible approach to this. And, you know, kind of from a place of wisdom, right, students will say, or supervisors, you know, will kind of warn and say, I don't know how well that will be received by the examiners, right? So you'll want to kind of say something that's much more straightforward. And that can be a bit damaging, right? I mean, that can really, you know, so there's something around, you know, at least kind of acknowledging that, yes, that flexibility is important, but let's make sure that we display it in a way, you know, that it doesn't get misunderstood or misread by examiners or by reviewers, you know, if we're talking about publishing. So, you know, that is an interesting point, right? That the students look at that and say, no, I don't want that. I want really, you know, kind of fixed structures that will allow me to pass my PhD, to publish my papers, right? Like they really just want it really fixed like that. But you know, we're losing something there in the communication. Specialized skills, marginally perceived as valuable. I think that's an interesting one, because specialized skills is good, because there's this sense that it's like, well, what am I doing in terms of developing the skills in my specific topic, in my specific area? And really, I think for things like, you know, first publishing, or, you know, kind of getting that doctoral thesis, you know, there's a kind of recognition, you know, that, oh, okay, that's, you know, these are ideas that I just kind of need to show a certain competence about. It's not necessarily something that I need to show, I don't know, advanced skill ability to maneuver, or, you know, kind of throughout the topic. Now, obviously, this is from the students. I don't think this is necessarily the case. I don't support this as you know, this is a good way to deal with doctoral students. But I think, you know, it's interesting, you know, that they kind of looked at that and said, oh, no, it's, you know, it's really about what's expected of me to pass my thesis. You know, it's sort of all about this, get published, pass my thesis. And there's no kind of strong sense of like, oh, these are the skills that I'm developing as an expert in this area. So maybe really, if anything, something to kind of help bring back. Working outside academia is still research skills dependent. Now, that's a really interesting perception of the students, right? That they kind of look at the research skills that are involved in doing the research as a doctoral student and saying, I see that these are transferable, right? I see that these are useful for me, even if I'm not going on to become an academic myself, right? So all of the skills that I'm developing by doing this doctorate, whatever kind of work I'm going into, they will be useful for me. And I kind of gave examples in there. So I do recommend having a look at some of the work of Horta, who does publish in all of these higher education journals. So you'll see some good examples in there from that. But I can see some really good possibilities for extending some of this into applied linguistics research as well. Yeah, this was one of the comments that was made by one of the participants at this workshop. And it was said to Horta, kind of in the Q&A at the end of his session, this person said, to get a job at a Chinese university, you need 3, right, Scopus indexed publications. And people in the chat were kind of going, yeah, it's true, or some people are kind of saying, oh, I think at my university it's 2, or saying this. But it was just so interesting to see, it was kind of one comment after the next of people saying, oh my gosh, we're under so much pressure, right? And it can't be just any journal. It has to be these specific journals. It has to be a Q1 journal. It has to be, so we have all these ways of kind of describing the journals, and again, it becomes more of this get something done rather than recognizing the skills involved in getting there. And so this was something that kind of, in his response, he kind of said, okay, yes, with these things, with these requirements in place, yes, you do need to achieve them, but you need to think about why the institutions have put them in place. I mean, for one, universities where the students have these publications are more employable, and so they have more graduates getting more jobs, and so the university goes up in the rankings. So we could be we could be a bit pessimistic about this and say this is all just about university rankings, but we shouldn't do that, right? We need to recognize that asking doctoral students to publish is really around recognizing that there's a skills base there that's slightly different, right, from writing for thesis, right? So let's think about that. What are the processes involved in that? And so it was good because we were able to kind of talk about that when this came up in the workshops, to be able to kind of get the students to sort of stop and think, like, oh, okay, right, yeah, there's actually something more involved here than just more boxes for me to tick on my way to getting from my doctorate into academia. Okay, so yeah, I mentioned that, Wilkins, Hazam, and Lean paper. So their paper was Doctoral Publishing as Professional Development for a Career in Higher Education. This is an interesting, we see this International Journal of Management Education. This is an area, this management education field, where they do a lot of, they do MBAs and DBAs, so kind of business administration at the doctoral level that's focused on educational leadership. And it is interesting to kind of see some of the research that happens in some of these journals. So I do recommend checking them out. The highlights from this particular paper, I think, are worth talking about. So the first one, previous research suggests that doctoral students need more support to publish. Okay, so it's fine to put kind of recommendations in place or even requirements in place for doctoral students to publish, but we need to make sure that institutions actually have the support systems in place for them to do that, and not just supervisors, do more, right? Get your students to publish. Doctoral publishing has positive effects on skills development and career progression. So that's an interesting one, right? So it's not just university rankings, right? It's recognizing that actually part of this process is helpful for increasing transferable skills, and thinking about kind of development of the identities of these people as researchers, right? Thinking about how that carries on into their careers. Various factors push students toward publishing in high-ranking journals. That was an interesting one because this is in relation to a lot of the pressure that students feel. So this idea that it's not necessarily a fixed statement, it's not necessarily an institutional requirement that students need to publish in these journals. They kind of generate a lot of it themselves, right? So there's this sense that, oh, no, don't bother trying to publish in that journal. It needs to be this journal because, that one won't count. And there's, probably really no evidence for anything like that. So it's looking at, okay, what are we doing, or what kind of rhetoric is happening around this idea of getting students to publish? So yeah, for me, it's about the processes involved. But when you look at it this way as, oh no, you just need to publish in the highest impact factor you can, it really changes it. We kind of lose a focus on the process. Students require active self-developmental learning and institutional support. So this is an interesting one to think about. Okay, where is the part of the process that we are generating self-developmental learning? Right? Where is the guidance or scaffolding to put in place for early career researchers to say how, right, to kind of help support establishing themselves, right? So in the kinds of ways of writing about things, where is that sense of like, okay, you have that way of writing about things and that's coming through and that message is coming through. If that's not coming through from you, right, then this is an area you need to work on. And it's really an area that only you can work on because it's you, right? So, where are those processes? Where are the questions, right? What kinds of systems do we have in place to help develop that? Yeah, not everybody is going to agree with me that that's something that's really particularly important. And I'll get into this, and when I get into the study, about some of the resistance I've had to the study that I've done and the frameworks that I've used. But yeah, for me, I agree with Wilkins's and lean on this. Now, their last highlight that I think is really interesting is they say supervisors or advisors must assume a key role in mentoring and guiding students. Now, for me, that kind of goes against the highlight just before it. They're kind of saying, we need self-developmental learning. But this idea that, assuming a key role in mentoring and guiding students, I think is just a bit of recognition, right? That this is where it's going to go, right? So, institutions don't just throw everything on the supervisors to say, make this happen, get your students to publish. Recognize that the pressure is going to fall onto the supervisors and advisors of students and provide the kind of institutional support to help everybody make that happen, I think is really the bigger message there. All right. This is, so yeah, Kei Guchion was also a part of the workshop in June of last year. And she does a lot of work on developing skills for research writing. She's really interested in things like writer identity and kind of developing it. So, we are fans of each other's work. And she said in her workshop, supervision is described as the most important determinant of doctoral success and is therefore an important interpersonal academic practice. So this is an interesting one, right? To kind of stop and recognize that, the whole act of supervision, there's a pedagogy in place, right? There's an interpersonal academic practice that's happening, and not just a kind of top down, let me show you what to do and then you do it and you get your PhD and we move on, right? It's about what are we developing between us, right, as supervisor and doctoral student. So highlighting some of the points from her own research and looking at some of the kind of key concepts, she points out that early career researchers view the experience of supervision and teaching as core to succeeding with an academic career. So they know, right, that having a good supervisor and being able to work with that supervisor and seeing that supervisor as a good supervisor is really important. So being able to kind of talk through that, I think, is something that she highlights. Development of an academic sense of self requires the right formal institutional structures, responsibilities, and resources. So this is kind of looking at what's in place. This idea of the right formal institutional structures, I think, is a good one, because it's not just about, oh, look, we've provided this, for example, at UCL, a Center for Doctoral Education, right? So they say, we've got a whole center dedicated to this, but we have to kind of stop and look at it and say, but what is it doing? And how can we regularly return to it and think about, improving it? And I think the CDE at UCL does what it can for that, because it's receptive. So I think that's what it comes down to, is a receptive institutional structure. New expanded pedagogies of supervision are now required. Supervision is an ecology of multiplayer systems. This is a really interesting point that she raises. It's recognition that supervision has changed. I think, at a time when we didn't really have that many doctoral students, especially that many doctoral students in applied linguistics, there was kind of not a lot of understanding about kind of what was involved in the processes, right? We're kind of developing as a field to kind of see what happens. This idea of there being an ecology of multiplayer systems, this is going back to some of the stuff that Horta found with his students as well, that people are looking for teamwork, they're looking for that kind of partnership, right, collaboration as much as they can. Obviously, when we look at this in relation to publishing, it gets a little bit fuzzy, right? Because then we have publishing, supervisors and students publishing together. That is a possible outcome, right, of an ecological multiplayer approach to supervision, but it is not the only one, right? So we do want to think about what are some of the possibilities for us to recognize what can come out of something that's more of a collaborative partnership between a supervisor and a supervisee, that kind of, within reason. The other thing about this, of course, is recognizing that that's not the only relationship, right? So much of it then as well is around the group of the cohort of other doctoral students, right? The bigger department, the institution-wide, beyond the institution. We have all these different circles that we're kind of moving in. So it's kind of making sure, right, that people are a part of those, not allowing anyone to become too isolated. If the relationship is only between the student and the supervisor, and I've had some of this, right, the learning, right, is so limited, right? You're really stuck in this tiny space, and then all these other influences, there tends to be resistance to that, and there's so much potential for those influences to really inform and help shape and really help contribute to development. I think particularly with understanding who you are as a researcher, right? If you only know what your relationship is as a doctoral student in relation to your supervisor, that's a really limited scope, right, of understanding of who you are. If you are putting yourself in the bigger field of applied linguistics, right, if you can kind of interact and contribute in different ways with particularly other doctoral students, then, right, you have a much stronger sense of understanding who you are in your field, who you are in relation to different arguments, different schools of thought, how much is the kind of theoretical framework and your understanding of it, how does that fit in with others? So at UCL we have reading groups, we have Bourdieu reading groups and Bernstein reading groups, and all, and these students get together, and they're not all just in agreement with each other. There's not one person standing there telling them how Bourdieu works or how Foucault works or how it's them there exchanging their ideas and establishing a sense of kind of a bit of a spectrum, really, kind of, and where they fit into it within that reading group. So there's so much potential here for this. So this is the question: how can doctoral students learn these skills? Well, Guccione says thesis mentoring. And so this is getting into the study that we conducted, but some really important highlights. So this is the foundation for the study that I worked with 5 doctoral students at UCL on, is this idea of feedback. So the feedback is what shaped it. So Brian Palchard, who was one of my original doctoral supervisors at the University of Sydney, and who I worked with really closely. So my first postgraduate teaching at the University of Sydney was with Brian. He said that the idea of feedback says it's through feedback that students are inducted into the community of practice of their discipline. And I really, really appreciate this quote. Now, he was referring here specifically to supervisor feedback, but I think, we can really use this in so many ways to just look at, kind of feedback in general, right? So between, with doctoral students, early career researchers, with anyone, right? That this kind of feedback, recognizing that we're constantly being inducted into the community of practice because the community of practice is constantly changing. Arguments in support of peer feedback. Now, this was a bit harder for me. I had to go to the literature in the United States. I had to go to kind of slightly older literature. And I also had to look at the L1 literature because we didn't really have much on L2. L2, so second language writing feedback, so much of it was about kind of academic writing support. It's like grammar and structure and using nuances of, there's very little kind of recognition of the reality that most people writing at the doctoral level, in applied linguistics, I should say, in English are not L1 users of English, right? We've got all this whole field of people writing in English, early career researchers, right? Not just doctoral writing. That where English isn't the first language. So kind of building, there's definitely a gap here, and one that we're trying to address with this study. But drawing on some of the ideas I think do inform well. Mullen and Tuchin from 2010, they raised this idea of constructive criticism as an important skill that gets developed in doctoral peer mentoring. And I totally get that, right? So constructive criticism is definitely different from the kind of feedback that a lot of second language writers get, where it's so much is focused on language use. It's sort of like, well, where do they kind of receive something like constructive criticism, recognize it as constructive criticism, feed it into who they are as academic writers, and then carry that through, right? How do they then use that skill to produce and provide constructive criticism themselves? Woodhouse and Wood more recently kind of focused on this idea of what happens in peer feedback as a focus on critical writing and clarity of language, right? So you can kind of see where, right, yeah, this happens, right? I think there's a sense of doctoral peer feedback where they don't want to kind of take it too far. You know, they'll kind of say, oh, that kind of criticism or constructive criticism is for your supervisors, right? For me, you know, well, we're only doctoral students, so I'm only going to really focus on clarity of language. I think there's a bit of a danger with that, but I think there's potential for it. I think we can recognize that that's where they are, right? That's what they're thinking. It's like, okay, well, if I'm going to provide feedback on your writing, I can really only comment on clarity of language. So with our framework, kind of addressing that point. Woodhouse and Wood also said, giving and receiving peer feedback can be challenging, emotional, and frustrating experience for novice writers. So I think, yeah, this idea of it's scary, right? Basically, you know, I think this is scary for all writers, let alone writers who are using English not as their first language. So, you know, the criticism that, you know, I say, you know, don't look at how I wrote that so badly. Please don't say anything, you know, about that bit. I know that's terrible. You know, you get a lot of this engagement. My students do this with me all the time. We'll be talking through a draft and they'll say, oh, I'm sorry about that paragraph. It doesn't make any sense. And I'll say, no, that's fine. Let's talk through, you know, what was your intention with it? What do you want to do with it? Why are you so unhappy with it? You know, but yeah, you can get a sense, right, that there's a real emotional investment. I mean, you know, we get it, right? We're putting so much time and energy and effort into this writing. You really don't want somebody else to read it and deconstruct it. But that's what we're doing, right? So we want to think about how can we do that in a constructive way and providing constructive criticism that's supportive. So the project, yeah, it was a peer feedback study for supporting postgraduate writing and professional development. And the project is called Evolving Writer Identities. So we presented this in that session in June, and the main structure of the study is we use a framework that, so doctoral students are able to take this analytical framework of looking at writing, right? So they can take the framework and then they can apply it to another doctoral student's writing and then talk through it with them to kind of say, these are the things that I identified that fit into this framework. The framework so it's an original framework of mine. It's one that I published in System in 2018. And I'll show you the details of it in a moment, but this is what it's based on. So there's Clark and Avanich. Roz Avanich did a lot with these idea of possibilities for selfhood. So autobiographical, authorial, and discoursal selves, right? So kind of these three possibilities. And the idea of this framework is it's kind of highlighting these three selves and looking at how they interact and how they are kind of used or realized in doctoral writing. The way that we were able to do this kind of at the sort of clarity of language level is using Martin and White's appraisal framework. So the appraisal framework has three systems: attitude, engagement, and graduation. I'm going to have to refer to my notes to get into the specifics about what they are. For attitude, for effect, this is the emotional evaluation. So looking at any points where a writer kind of uses a kind of emotional argument, right? With judgment, this is ethical evaluation. So kind of, you know, where people might, you know, look at something related to kind of good or bad or making these types of judgments. Appreciation, this is aesthetic or functional evaluation. So kind of where do we see it's sort of, yeah, enjoyment or, you know, or some kind of something purposeful about what they're doing in their writing. So right, somebody has to go through the writing and try to identify examples of these in the writing. Engagement, there are two systems for engagement in Martin and White's system. There's heterogloss and monogloss. In the heterogloss, this is the presence of other voices versus monogloss, which is the voice of the author only. Now, because I'm looking at this collaboratively, I didn't use monogloss, the voice of the author only, even though that comes through and really it does kind of make connections with the autobiographical self. But I was more interested in the heterogloss, which is, yeah, presence of other voices, and we have different ways of showing that, and there are quite strong connections between that and the authorial and discoursal selves. Graduation is force and focus, right? So it's the blurring or sharpening with the focus, or the impact with force. So there's different, right, using words like very, or, you know, exceptionally, or, you know, this kind of language that really helps to sort of shape what happens. All right. With those frameworks, what I did for using this framework, now notably, I used this framework for undergraduate writers. I used this for undergraduate writers of English in Japan. Now, this is where I got a lot of pushback, right? So, you know, I was saying before that not everybody really agrees with this whole idea. And I kind of get it. You know, now that I've done this with doctoral writing, I can see maybe I was being a little too ambitious trying to use this with undergraduate writers. But the idea here was that I was able to kind of use it as a way for teachers of writing at undergraduate level to kind of use this as a framework for looking for these elements. So for example, so autobiographical, authorial, and discoursal, looking then at those three systems across, there are these resources for constructing selves, and this kind of helps to kind of clarify what they are. So an autobiographical self, you know, with attitude, this is personal opinion, right? So this is where, you know, you really see a lot of emotion and appreciation conditions or functions. So it's, you know, really about kind of, you know, in my experience, you know, this is what I've done. With engagement at that level, right, this is about local context. So being able to say, you know, well, in my context, right, this is what happens, or, you know, in my culture, or something like that. Graduation is just personal emphasis, and this would be based on cultural norms, is where you would expect to see it. So, right, kind of going across and understanding the relationship between these two different, really, they're not two different frameworks, but I put them together in that way. It allows us to think about, you know, what is the writer's intention and what are they doing at these different levels. Now, the thing that's most important about this for doctoral writing, if I can get this to show you, there it is the authorial self. So this is the area, and going back to Morton and Storch, and, you know, a lot of the focus that second language writing researchers have on writing at this level is this recognition of a need to establish a clear authorial self. And you can see this, right? So as far as attitude goes with the authorial self, it's your own interpretation. You know, so as a doctoral writer, or as an early career researcher, or somebody trying to establish a particular argument for publication purposes, for example, your own interpretation is really important, right? Your analysis, your evaluation. So recognizing that and seeing how that fits in is really important. Now, this does vary between kind of mixed methods research, qualitative research, quantitative research. People will argue with me to say, you know, oh, but quantitative researchers, you know, what you're talking about is so subjective. This is only really relevant for qualitative researchers, but that's not true. The reality is, you know, everybody has to kind of use, you know, ultimately their own interpretations about what's happening. Even if a quantitative measure is a fixed measure, right, there's still your interpretation in terms of the analysis, you know, of working through that process and showing us what you decide to show us, right? So you have to kind of make those decisions. With engagement, right, this is endorsements or critiques of your own or others' arguments. So kind of looking at providing evidence, but not just the evidence, but kind of like clarifying, engaging with it, right? Kind of clarifying, you know, here are these arguments, but, you know, what is it about them in terms of where I fit in with them? And I think this is an area that we see kind of missing with a lot of writing, and not just, you know, I'm thinking about this as an editor at System as well, that when the papers come through, some of the comments that we'll kind of send back to people, you know, at the desk rejection stage, unfortunately, is, you know, with an engagement of literature, it's, you know, you can show us this literature, but you need to show us kind of how what you've done here, you know, fits in with that, and then how it responds to that, or how it informs it, or you know, critiques it in some way. I mean, you know, it's not just kind of showing us, you know, here are these ideas, and then a bunch of literature. So often, really, the big suggestion is kind of cut the literature down, right? I think so much of it is, yeah, and doctoral writers, I mean, they kind of need to do this, right? Because they have to show that breadth, right? So you'll see long strings of citations, right, where they'll say all of these people kind of made comments, or, you know, have you know, can support each other on this idea, and they'll show, you know, 5, 6 different citations. For publication, it doesn't work, right? Because you have to be engaging with all of them. So, right, usually one of the first things back, and you can see this because you get, oh, this must be somebody who's trying to publish from their thesis, right? Because it's just got all this literature. And you say, no, no, cut it down. Focus us just on the ones that you're really engaged with. So yeah, I think that's enough about that system. Hopefully that makes sense. Definitely check out the paper because it's structured for undergraduate teachers of undergraduate writing. So it kind of it sort of brings it into something that's hopefully more usable. The identity appraisal analysis is what it was. This is an example of a practice text that we used in the group. So it was me working with 3 PhD students and 2 EdD students. Not all my supervisees, mostly my supervisees, but not all of them. And what we did was we actually just really simply coded it in this way. So we, looking at examples of autobiographical, authorial, and discursive self, we used 3 different colors to highlight. And for the appraisal system, attitude, engagement, and graduation, we changed the color of the font. So it was really just that simple. Now, I'm showing you this example here. If I showed you all 6, you would see really very different interpretations, right? We all read things differently. We see things differently. I mean, basically, some things kind of fit in. There's sense that in an introduction to a chapter that you're going to have something that's a bit more discursive because there's something maybe potentially more objective. It does depend on what they're doing and what chapter it is in the thesis. But then, getting into the origins of the story of a study for this particular example, this was a personal rationale, right, that the student is providing at this stage. So obviously this is autobiographical. So things like that, as a group, we were able to identify consistently. But getting into the kind of more detailed things, I think particularly differences between authorial and discursive self because of the kind of level of engagement or clarity of engagement was a real issue. And I'll bring up some of those examples. So just a few of them, not every student, but this was one of the EdD students, Joseph, on the project. He worked with a teacher in further education. So he worked with another EdD student. Now, EdD students, this is the professional doctorate. So a lot of them have years and years and years of either teaching experience or experience working in education in some form. So he was a manager at a university of a language program, and then he had this teacher in further education who he's working with. And this particular teacher works with students who had trouble passing their math exams. And so the project investigated students' prior experiences of schooling in maths to try to recognize some of the weaknesses or what some of the problem areas. In this project, everybody conducted 2 interviews with their participants, right? So with their peers in this study. And in the first one, they really just kind of went into the person's experience of academic writing in a second language. In general, for them, that was writing in English as a second language. Prior to writing up their institution-focused study, which is part of the staged process of doing this professional doctorate. They do this kind of smaller study, and then they do the main study. In the second interview, this is where Joseph conducted the stimulated recall interview using the analysis that was done, right, with the highlighting, kind of going through and talking with the student, so why did you use this language in this way, and kind of checking, right, is this you engaging with the literature or is this your voice, right? So kind of asking questions and showing, right, the student, here's what I highlighted based on my analytical framework, this is what we think. And they used, the kind of older study, so not the thesis that the student was working on at the time, but actually a piece of older writing. And the findings, it interweaves authorial, autobiographical, and discursive self. So Joseph found actually there was a real mix of all 3 of these to create a rationale for the topic. It was interesting, though, this comment on the use of autobiographical self. So this student said, for me, it makes it stronger. It exists because I've experienced this, so it is a problem. I have experienced it as a teacher. So I think that showing I have some experience with that justifies my aims and my purpose as to why I'm trying to do this. It's not a randomly chosen topic. So this is a really interesting comment. And this is something that we do see in a lot of the language education, the pedagogical side of applied linguistics research, is people providing this kind of personal rationale and connection, right? Based on my experience, this is a gap in the research that I'm addressing in this study. So we do see this kind of thing a bit more in that area of applied linguistics research. So Joseph pointed out that this student was positioning herself as a socially engaged researcher. So that's that authorial side, who shows empathy for her students, which is autobiographical, right? It's kind of personal experience, and focuses on the student's voice, right? So then there's that removal and focusing on other voices, this discursive self. She champions the cause of students that have been forgotten and neglected. So, right, so going back to her job, right? So her job is working with students who fail. So there's a real sense, right, that she needs to try to help them in some way. So for Joseph, in his reflection, he said that the close analysis made him more aware of the selves created in writing and the semantic choices that achieve this. So that was an interesting point to kind of, say, I see that if you state it in this way, it shows this self, right? If you state it in this way, it shows a different self. And how can I kind of balance that? He recognized also the limitations of a discoursal style and the importance of the connection between writer and reader. So, discoursal being that more objective, right, kind of removed self, so kind of, referring to the work of others for the most part. For Joseph, especially I think for a professional doctorate, he's kind of recognized, the connection here isn't the same. So we see the same kind of thing, I think, for transferring this into publication as well. Is how important is it that we have a sense, as reviewers, as editors, that people are showing us that kind of specific connection. How much do we need to raise the authorial and autobiographical selves and push down the discoursal self, right? So this is the kind of thing we need to think about. It has everything to do with the topic, the research questions, right? There's really nothing else to kind of decide that otherwise. All right, one of the PhD students, this is a Chinese PhD student, Dan Dan. She was working with another Chinese PhD student who was working in higher education studies. And it was really interesting because, in the very first interview with her participant, the person said thesis writing was painful, right? It's really painful, it's difficult. My goal is just to finish the task. I understand I have an audience, or no, sorry, I do have an audience, but I don't really think about that. I just want to finish it. That's a really kind of honest, realistic, comment to make about this. So on the right side of the screen, you can see an example of some of the comments that Dan Dan made on her writing. So she's kind of going through and recognizing things as engagement or attitude, but also just trying to confirm these points and, what about this emphasis? Why did you use it? That kind of thing. So in then the simulated recall interview, which was the second one, on the idea of attitude, so opinion, interpretation, evaluation, or engagement, appealing to local context, there's difference between discoursal or authorial. Dan Dan noticed that there was a mismatch between what this student was trying to do and how she was reading it. Now, obviously, and Dan Dan made the point in the interview to say, look, this is just that way that I'm seeing it, that I'm reading. I know that other people are maybe reading it very differently. Your supervisors may be reading it very differently. Other people can read it too. So there's this whole thing about recognition that this is really my interpretation based on what you're reading, but I'm seeing it differently from what you're telling me you've written here in response to some of these questions on the side. And this, this has a huge influence on both of them, really. The participant in this case reported that the feedback and discussion really helped her to gain greater clarity, what to change in her writing, and kind of taking more of a proactive position as a writer. So it wasn't just about, let me get through this process, I just want this done. It's, oh, yeah, why did I say it that way? And what does it mean for me to have said it that way, right? So the recognition of the process and really being able to learn from that. She said things like the whole section serves as contextual information, and that's my personal interpretation. It's a general idea. When I'm reading it now, I feel like I need to have more references. Otherwise, people ask, where did you get this impression? It's not my original feelings. I'd better cite something. So there's that, right? She can kind of stop and say to herself, oh, hold on. I've stated this here, but actually this was from my reading. I need to make that connection. And that's something that'll, kind of help that student to pass, right? Because otherwise examiners will do exactly this. And they'll look at this and say, whose ideas are these? And why haven't you cited these key scholars? She also said she recognized that this opportunity to, because she was very resistant, I should say, to participating in this and sharing her writing, but they were, they were friends. And so that was how they managed to agree to do it. But looking at her thesis in such a detailed way is really useful. Reflecting on the writing process to see what's necessary, what's not necessary, things you want to change. It really kind of changed the way she thought about her writing. And for Dan Dan, in her reflection, she said, that to outline various interpretations of her writing is really helpful. Exploring the connection between her intentions and the form of writing is helpful. And also thinking about using the framework as a tool for articulating nuanced differences and providing peer feedback, right? So not just thinking about how is this kind of informing her own writing, but how does this inform how I talk to other people about their writing? And that's a really valuable looking at sustainability skills and transferability of skills into employability. Okay, so the last PhD student example here is from Nathan, who is English L1, by the way. So we had a mix in terms of the doctoral students who were part of the core project, but all of their participants were using English as L2. So in this case, his participant was also a Chinese student in psychology of music. What he found was really a complex authorial self, mostly because he couldn't really distinguish between authorial and discoursal, a lot of the selves. In the interview, the student said things like, I just chose a paper, this one seemed good, so I used it to support my idea. So there's kind of lack of engagement there. I read their work, I know they do a lot of research on music, so I'm just telling what I got from them, right? So it's reporting rather than engaging. And the student says, you can't really have your own voice, right? You intentionally disconnect. So it's kind of forcing this discoursal self, right? You try to give the feeling this thing is really serious and scientific and objective. You can't have subjective feelings or emotions involved at all. Now, this may be something specific to psychology of music, right? That particular area. It may be that this is just a sense that the student has about what it means to write at this level. In terms of the absence of autobiographical self, this person said, oh my God, well, that's interesting. It's not that you would be punished for putting I in your writing, but people in psychology don't use I or we. I try to get the people out of the context so that people can see this as a very serious scientific report. I'm not sure because it's not applied linguistics, so maybe, but for my applied linguist doctoral student, Nathan, looking at this, he's kind of saying, right, okay, so he's saying, as a reader, I don't know anything about this. I don't understand what links you, I don't know who you are, right? And so she said, oh yeah, that's a good point. I do play this instrument, which was the focus of this PhD thesis. Whether I play it or not is actually irrelevant to my experiment. So I try to write only closely to what I actually did, to the experiment itself. So it seems irrelevant. It won't be mentioned in my writing, right? So there won't be any of that background. And that's really interesting, right? So, I mean, part of this is I would love to kind of follow up on this to see, how did all this play out for the student? But as an applied linguist, Nathan kind of looks at this and says, So yeah, he reflected on this with this idea of an invisible self, and said, using this analytical framework gave him the opportunity to learn about the writerly selves and saying, seeing all the coloring here, I'm a bit worried if I'm over-referencing or something. That was a response from him to the student when they were talking through. So in the stimulated recall interview, so where he had all of the different highlights where he was trying to identify all the different selves. So it was kind of an interesting point, kind of looking at this sort of, how are we talking about this and which selves are we trying to get in here? So he was using colors on colors, right? So he was kind of mixing them to kind of say, I don't know which self this is. The importance of stimulated recall, right, is that really what he was looking at was ambiguous. But being able to talk through it was really important. And so, as a kind of peer activity, this was something that he saw as really very useful and effective for him. In the analysis and discussion, he noticed better citation practices can reduce ambiguity as far as the authorial voice goes. So, making it clear whether citations support the author's statement, as in, I found this from the reading to support my statement, or I read this and so I made this statement, right? So, kind of making that point clear. This was a real discussion that the two of these students had. And that he said that he believed that this is something that can be taught explicitly regardless of genre. And so this idea of kind of teaching selves, he saw as a useful point, which was nice for me to hear, because when I was trying to kind of push the point about using this teaching selves for undergraduate students, I got pretty much, most people telling me, no, that's nonsense, you can't do that. So, but maybe for doctoral students, it's okay. All right, so yeah, just kind of finishing up here, giving and receiving peer feedback on doctoral writing. So thinking about using this kind of framework for peer feedback, and really this is something I think, not just for doctoral students, right? I mean, really any two researchers can who can sit down and do this with each other, even, I mean, in related fields that don't have to be exactly the same field. And with applied linguistics, right, we get that a lot. So yeah, use a framework that focuses on the intentions of the message. I think that's the important thing. So when you're when two people are kind of working together to read each other's writing, having some kind of guidance in terms of what to look for is really important. Otherwise, you get into this whole, I looked at clarity of language. Well, is clarity of language for what purposes for me, right? So what is it about the clarity of what you're saying in terms of your intention? So, was the intention to engage at an authorial level? Were you actually trying to be more discoursal and remove yourself from this by putting in these citations? Right? What was the intention at this level? And then we can consider how and when balancing different writer identities is appropriate. So this was this point I was making before about, for the professional doctorate, the EdD, should they be increasing an autobiographical self because their experience is so important to the doctoral work that they're doing? This can feed into the same thing, right, with topics, right, methodologies. The difference that we kind of noted in the study was really between the PhD writing and the EdD writing. For PhD writing, locating the authorial self was so important, and ensuring that it was discernible from a discoursal self. So basically, in all of the examples, I saw a real mix and difficulty making the difference. So balancing these with an autobiographical self as needed, because maybe in psychology they don't really do. With EdD writing, there is a need to boost the authorial and discoursal, boosting the authorial self as the discoursal self isn't enough, right? So you have to do more with the authorial self. You can do that by using autobiographical self when connecting with participants as well as readers. So you can kind of show your own interpretation and connection at an authorial level by bringing in more of an autobiographical self. Now, in terms of thinking about our evolving identities and thinking about how we can learn from all these types of processes, I'm just going to draw on a couple of examples. So there's a nice picture of Brian Paltridge on there, but as well as Andy Gao, who was my co-editor-in-chief at System for many, many years, but he just retired from System in December and is now editor of the International Review of Applied Linguistics for language learning and teaching. I don't know if I got all of that right, but yeah, do check out that journal because, of course, Andy is an absolutely fantastic editor. So in the book that I mentioned earlier on the kind of honest depictions, right, of problems that people experienced and how they overcame them, in my book in 2017, so Andy's chapter in the book was about dealing with criticism and the criticism of, in particular, blind reviewers, right? So people who aren't even attached to it. So he said, drawing on his encounters with the reviewers, he discusses in this chapter how qualitative researchers can respond to the challenges posed by anonymous reviewers. And basically what he does, he shows in the chapter some excerpts from some of these anonymous reviews, and you can see that they are very harsh. And it's actually really hard to see anything constructive in them at all. And if you read them from an emotional level, like Andy would have, because it's his writing, it would have been very difficult to see anything constructive in there. But what he does is he basically talks you through in the chapter the process of making that feedback constructive, right? So thinking, all right, let me open myself up to the possibilities of what this anonymous reviewer may have actually intended, because it didn't come through in the way that they wrote it. But let me see if I can kind of work with that and kind of make that into something. And he did, right? And he used it. And he was able to kind of use that feedback to improve the paper and ultimately get it published. So that whole kind of process and experience is such an interesting one. And because it's, I think, useful for all of us, thinking about, how do we take feedback that we just think, gosh, that's really not helpful or useful at all? How can we actually use it? I find myself going through this practice all the time. I just had some feedback from a paper that was rejected in December, and I'm working with my co-author, looking through the comments, and we're both talking to each other, saying, "Gosh, really nothing helpful in here at all." And then kind of stopping and saying, "Right, let's remember Andy's chapter. Okay, where can we actually pull out something that's useful here and help us to actually get this paper published?" We're still working on it. So Brian Paltridge was an editor of T-Cell Quarterly for many years. He's not now. He was before the current ones who are in place now. But he had some really great insights and did a lot with shaping T-Cell Quarterly as an editor. And he was talking about doing reviewing and did a study with reviewers to kind of get their ideas about it. And he found in this study that he published in 2013 that reviewers learned by reading reviews of their own submissions to peer-reviewed journals. So reviewers do what they do based on the experiences they've had and what they've received. All right, so it's this cyclical process. So this is going back to the same thing with supervisors, right? That we supervise based on the experiences we've had being supervised. So it's this, something that's really kind of good to keep in mind, as we're reviewing things, is how can we ensure that we're being constructive and maintaining a constructive critical standpoint, because we want to make sure that that comes back to us, right? So what you feed into the cycle, right, it should come back to you in the same way. But right, these reviewers recognize that really the most challenging aspect was being critical but still constructive, right? So it is pretty easy to critique things, but how to actually turn that into something that you can do. So it's about taking that extra step and taking that extra time and adding that bit of constructiveness to it, right? And trying to find something positive in there. Otherwise, like in Andy's chapter, you're kind of leaving the writers to try to figure out how to make these criticisms constructive. So I'm focusing here a little bit on reviewing. And so basically, for anybody who isn't reviewing for journals, definitely train and register as a reviewer, because this is going to help you to get published, and it's certainly going to help you develop as a writer in your field, in your specific area. There are training events, especially in the COVID era. We've got lots of these online and accessible around the world. So how to be an effective peer reviewer. There are webinars for researchers in the humanities, social sciences, and arts and related research fields. And this is coming from Taylor and Francis. So that's the example at the top on the right side. You can also check publishers' websites for registration forms. I know a lot of the Elsevier journals have those forms where you can just kind of fill them out to register yourself for that journal as a reviewer. And then you go into our system so that when we search for keywords in relation to what's been submitted, and we're looking for reviewers, if they match up with your keywords that you've put in as a potential reviewer, we will invite you to review. So have a look at some of the journals that you're most interested in and see about registering. If those specific journals don't have websites for registering, you can email the journal editors, let them know why you would be a good reviewer. Let them know your level of qualification and number of publications you've published, number of papers you've published, because all of that will help. But certainly most importantly is these are the areas of expertise that I have and that I can offer. If you've got the evidence to kind of show that you have it, so published papers, things like that, definitely say that. But really it is very helpful. We're constantly looking for reviewers, especially to fill particular areas, and not just topics, but methodologies in particular, right? So people who can work with particular methodologies, and we kind of match them up with submissions. So please do have a look at some of those opportunities. So Taylor and Francis has a training network. They do workshops and webinars. They actually also conduct these in different languages. And I believe Thai is one of the languages of these workshops, so you can check that out. And then otherwise, Elsevier has a sign up to become a reviewer option on most of its journals. That is it for the talk. I can tell I need some water now. Lots of references here. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor McKinley, for addressing this interesting topic. This is very true for graduate students and novice researchers to develop their own identity for research, conduction, and publication purposes, regardless of country and discipline. Publications are an expectation, if not a requirement, to obtain a PhD. I totally agree that PhD students in many countries are under publication pressure, including Thai students, because they are required to publish their dissertation in quality peer-reviewed journals. It is not easy to adjust one's life to publish scholarly manuscripts. Doctoral students have not enough experience about publication. So it is important to offer advice about academic publishing for graduate students and include practical strategies about the process of breaking the ice in publishing that seems to surround graduate students. Graduate students have to go through many processes, including developing their own identity during their research conduction and publication. Now it's time for Q&A period. Our speaker will answer some questions from participants. You are also welcome to reflect your thoughts on this issue. Ladies and gentlemen, just to remind you, if you have any questions, you can still send them to the chat box. Questions, please.
I ended up talking longer than I thought I would.
That's wonderful. I like your talk so much. Okay. It's kind of, academic and entertaining at the same
Good. I mean, it's engagement, right? I mean, this is such a big part of it. I am interested in hearing people's thoughts about using this kind of framework. If they thought, would you be willing to do a kind of analysis of somebody else's writing like this? Because it is interesting for me to get that kind of feedback. I think mainly people think it's a bit of a complicated one, so it did require a little bit of training before using it. But maybe if that's sorted out between the people wanting to read each other's work. But yeah, do let me know what you think of that kind of framework.
Yeah. So I'd like to invite participants, okay? You can speak out your question. You can leave your question in the chat box. Or maybe Dr. Yusuf, you want to say something to reflect your thoughts on this, maybe?
Actually, it's not, I'm not sure it's a kind of question or not. I mean, I have had some experience talking with my friends that we are working together. I mean, sometimes it's not such that easy when we work together with supervisor, and we exchange some ideas about working with our supervisor. And one of the main problems that we found is that sometimes, because when we work with supervisor, it's somehow supervisor is located, superior, comparing to a supervisee. So sometimes when we have some kinds of issues, something that we are not agree with our supervisor, we are not afraid, and we are afraid to discuss, directly to him or her. So in this particular situation or in this particular phenomenon, do you have any ideas how to suggest those PhD students? Because not just only me, I guess there are still many PhD students or postgraduate students who still under pressure when they have to work with their supervisors.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do often feel like every supervisor journey should experience certain levels of resistance and conflict, right? I mean, this is this idea of conflict for growth, right? I mean, UCL, one of UCL's mottos is disrupting thinking since 1826.
Because by the end of the day, or by the end of their PhD journey, it seems like they have to work in order to please their supervisors, not just because of they want to do. That's it. And some of them just told me that, okay, just follow what my supervisor said, and then after I finish my study, then I will do whatever I want. I'm free to do or to discuss whatever I want. So now just follow what they said first.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think this is probably what most doctoral students coming into their doctorate get a sense of, because that's what they've experienced, right? I mean, as an undergraduate student doing a master's, it's basically been, well, at the undergraduate level, it's do everything you're told and do it well, and you get an A, right? And then postgraduate level, it's, oh, suddenly I need to actually try to say something original. That's a bit harder, but I still am just kind of doing what I'm told, So suddenly at postgraduate level, there's this idea of, no, this is your project. You have to take us through it, and you have to show us, your original contribution, theoretically, methodologically, it's overwhelming for sure. So the reliance on the supervisor makes sense, right? Because it's kind of, this is the experienced person who's been through the process and knows and can share their experiences with me and take me through it, and I'm going to follow their guidance as closely as I can. But obviously, it has to kind of be within reason, right? And I think this is getting students to kind of recognize when the independence needs to kind of kick in the journey is probably one of the harder parts, because I think the reliance on the supervisor, if a supervisor can come across as not supportive, right, if not providing the kind of guidance that a student is expecting. So I think it's a gradual process for sure, and I think this is where I actually do think that something like this kind of framework is really helpful, because then it can take things off of the supervisor. So the idea is the supervisor gives this framework, goes through a bit of the training, right, with the students, and says, okay, now you guys do this with each other, all right, and go through this with each other. And then they can kind of come back and reflect on some of the ideas with the supervisor about, oh yeah, I was talking with this other student and about their writing, and we noticed that there were these elements of my writing that didn't come across clearly. What do you think of this, right? And then here we've already got the student doing their own thing, right? The supervisor can then provide a bit of support and guidance rather than fully steering and directing everything. So it's things like these types of activities. Thai universities, I know, have doctoral training, right, that doctoral students go through. It's good. I think a lot of supervisors don't necessarily do this, but talk with the students, get them to reflect on what those training experiences were like. So, for supervisors who are here today and students who are here today, if you're a supervisor or students, aren't here, talk with them about what it meant to kind of come to this session and what did you get out of it, and kind of see, maybe supervisors, you could say to the students, go watch the recording and see what you think. But it's this kind of thing, right? It's engaging with the support that's there to see, right, kind of where can you get people to maybe potentially do some things more with their own writing that don't directly involve the supervisor.
Yeah. Yeah. Any graduate students here? Would you like to, share something, from your own experience?
Or even Ajahn Sydney, you have just informed me that you would like to change the way of teaching after you listen to this session today, right? So can you reflect and can you share to us about your plan of your new teaching method?
Okay, it's not like a changing type, but I've got some ideas from today's session that, okay, this is how I'm going to do next time when I get my students I have students who are online these days and they just shut down everything and they don't contact us. So now that's difficult to get them to see you in the very first place. But however, with the framework you gave us, now I've got something serious to look at it now. I think it's great. It's great.
Oh, thank you. No, it's funny, right? Because I think getting especially students like that, right, that really shut down, and it happens all the time. But and it's so much easier for them to do that online, right? Because they can really they feel separated already. But having them, something like this where they can really kind of lock into the framework and say something about it, even if they're incredibly confused by it, it's okay.
I think after listening to your talk, it's more or less like, okay, now they have something to take away. They will begin to see themselves. What are they in terms of these that framework? I think that's the getaway. The takeaway today for me and also for the students in the future, if I can do it.
Fantastic. Yeah. It's actually, it is interesting to go through, because I've done some of these where I'm talking with students about, or students who, like the students who came to the workshop in June, right? So the doctoral students who were there, I was saying to them, even if you're too scared to show your writing to somebody else, try this analysis of your own writing and just have a look and see, how much yellow is there, how much gray, how much blue, what kind of balance is there? Is that what you intended, right? Is that who you want to be in that writing? Does that send the message clearly, right? Were you able to make the difference? And it was so interesting because I got emails then from some of them later saying, gosh, I tried this and I realized how, I had it ready to go. So I had to find somebody else who did it too. And then we were able to share ideas. And they said, it's like, no, we didn't know a lot of exactly, did we have this right? But that was the part that didn't matter, right? It was more about talking about their writing in a way that they just never talked about it before. That made all the difference for them.
That's interesting. I'll try it.
Yeah. Good. Yes. Yeah. And let me know how it goes.
I will.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Anybody else would like to share something or want to ask a question? We still have some more time.
Any students who have any questions about?
Yes, students, please.
Comments about it. Would be interested. Is it too scary?
Actually, my student Gagada, I'm not sure if he has left. Gagada, are you here? I think you can say something. Okay, Gagada, please say something. Share your experience, Kap.
Yes. Thank you so
Introduce
much.
yourself
And
first, Kakada.
yes, I would like to say good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kakada. I'm from Cambodia. Now, yeah, but for me, I feel like some part is over my ability to think out. Like normally, the professor talk related to doctoral degree. So some part I feel like, oh, it's too much. Sometimes I feel like I cannot understand the process of getting the doctoral degree, because right now I just think about master degree, but I feel a bit complicated. But when I just saw your presentation, I feel like, oh, master degree is, I think, harder, but doctoral degree very far harder than master degree. And we need a lot of experience. We need to read a lot. We need to gather as much information in order to get that. And we need to find what you just said, how to identify yourself in the way that you would like to present.
Yes. Good.
So
yes.
that's very hard question, how to identify yourself.
Right. I like that you said that the way you said it, though, because I think, yes, you do need to do, there is a lot of work for a doctorate, right? I mean, there's a lot of reading and kind of thinking about how those ideas from the reading go into your own thought processes. So kind of thinking from that as the basis of your understanding about it. But then, right, kind of thinking about how do I fit into it, I think is where things get more interesting and where you can really kind of propel and make your way through that doctorate, right? Is to kind of say, all right, now that I have this foundation about what this topic is and what the research and the methodologies that they use to investigate this topic, now that I have an understanding of it, that you work with your supervisor, right, who's an expert in the area, a related area. But from there, right, you then take your independence by kind of digging into it and saying, okay, but this is who I am in this. These are the arguments that I connect with. Where I don't connect with them. And that's where, having that kind of direct guidance from your supervisor actually isn't what you need, right? It's at that stage that you say to yourself, no, this is what's important to me and my argument, what I want to say. And from there, I think, sharing your writing with other people, especially people at the same, doing the same kind of thing, and exchanging writing with each other and trying to look at each other's writing and looking at the intentions of the writing can really be very helpful. And then you bring that back to your supervisor and you can impress them.
yes, that's what I get from. So we need, like what I normally get a lot of information about how to process for the thesis. And also we, like many senior, they also recommend us, like you have to keep a good relationship with your friend, with your advisor. And especially one thing that you should do is you have to have a peer review, or you need to teach your classmate if you know something, and maybe your classmate, they will know something else. So you should work in group or work with the peer review, like what just said. So that's also improved before we send it to our advisor in order to get more, our result more effective.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I think this is where we struggle, right? I think, when we're reading each other's writing, and then even like coming in to talk to your supervisor, right? Your supervisor, said, what do you want to talk about this time? And, as a supervisor, I generally say, can you send me an agenda for our next meeting so we can get through the points? So much of that is kind of student-led, but that's not the case, right? For a lot of people, right? The supervisor has an agenda and gives you everything. But here's a chance for you to kind of say, this is some structure to something, that I learned about and I want to try to work with and practice with. I did this with another student, and then with the supervisor, what do you think about what I found? And that can be really interesting.
Yes, because the professor, we can say the professor schedule completely busy. So we need to spend his time valuably.
Yes.
They are very, very busy.
This is
Thank
very
you very
true.
much,
Having an
Kakada.
agenda. Yes. Let me know how it goes.
Kakada, why don't you tell us who you are, what you are studying?
Okay.
Please.
And who is your supervisor?
I am the first year student in Royal Japan University. I'm here to continue my master degree, and I'm from Cambodia. I am a scholarship student from Cambodia to study in Thailand.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you so
thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we actually have spent quite a reasonable time, okay? And Dr. McKinley has clearly and insightfully addressed the issue of writer identities, and I'm sure that his elaboration has enlightened us. On behalf of PSU, the organizing host, I would like to say thank you very much to our guest speaker, Dr. Jim Mckelly. I hope you all enjoy his insightful and informative talk. Ladies and gentlemen, to show our appreciation, please give him a big round of applause.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
Yeah, before we end the virtual seminar today, I would like to invite Dr. Yusuf to inform us about the certificate that you will be receiving and other important announcements. It won't take long. Please stay on. Dr. Yusuf, over to you.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Associate Professor Dr. Jim Mckelly from University College London, and for your invaluable contribution of knowledge, and our moderator, Associate Professor Dr. Prakasit from Thammasat University, for running the event so smoothly today. For our lovely audience, on behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank you for joining the session today. I hope you have earned the knowledge you wish from our activity. And please do not forget to apply what you have learned today to your classroom or your academic work. Before we call it a day, I would like to ask for your cooperation to fill out a survey so that we can review your comments and feedback and improve our future events. Please click on the link, the survey in the chat box. And also, please do not forget to grab your certificate on the way out. After completing the survey and submitting it to the system, you will receive a separate link to fill out your name and email. So the system will automatically use the information provided to send you the certificate. So please check your email right after. And as you are completing the survey, and getting your certificate, I would like to take this opportunity to announce our next event under the PSU Open Mobility Program to be held on January 27. In this educational event, you will have an opportunity to meet with Associate Professor Dr. Martin Dewey from King's College London in the United Kingdom, who will be sharing knowledge and experiences with you on the topic of language policy and teacher education. So if you are interested, please do not hesitate to sign up by checking the new link in the chat box. So be sure to clear up your schedule and join us again then. Again, today I would like to thank you, our speaker, moderator, and every participant for being an important part of this activity. And I hope that we will see you again soon. So everyone, please have a nice day, and thank you very much for attending, your actively participation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.